As a physiotherapist, the muscular system known as myology is extremely important. Muscles around the body are used all the time. There are different types of muscles that are structured in order for them to carry out their specific function. This assignment will explain these types of muscles and more about myology. There are 7 main functions of the muscular system. First of all, movement. A main function of the muscular system is to provide the body for movement. This is because when the brain tells a muscle to move, the muscle will contract and it will typically become short and fat. For example, a third-class lever such as a bicep curl, the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii work as an antagonistic pair. The biceps brachii will contract, becoming short and fat, whilst the triceps brachii relax. This causes the muscle to pull on the tendon which attaches to muscle to bone, then causing the bone to move. A rule of muscles is that they can pull on the bone, but they can never push. Function is posture. The skeletal muscles are constantly working to provide the body with posture. Small-scale contractions take place, such as when moving position in a chair. When adjusting position to sit more upright, the muscles are working to provide you with the correct posture. Muscles such as the abdomen provide the body with a strong core stability. If your core muscles are weaker than they should be, it can lead to poor posture, which can lead to injuries. Another function of the muscular system is the myocardium. The heart is a muscle found in the center of the circulatory system that is specifically designed to contract, ejecting oxygenated blood that is passed from the lungs into the left side of the heart. When the heart contracts, it sends this oxygen-filled blood to the rest of the body through the arteries. On the other side of the heart, it receives deoxygenated blood from the veins. It then gets sent from the right side of the heart to the lungs, where the blood is filled with oxygen again. There are multiple parts of the heart, the left and right atrium which receives blood that is pumped to the left and right ventricle. The left ventricle has to be very strong as it pumps blood to the rest of the body. All these chambers work together in order to replenish and supply the body with oxygen to keep muscles and keep you alive. In a sporting scenario, when an athlete begins to run, the heart has to contract faster and harder in order to provide muscles with enough oxygen. This means that the heart rate will increase. Over a long period of time, with regular exercise, the heart will increase in size and the force of contraction will become stronger. This is known as cardiac hypertrophy. It will allow more blood to hold inside the heart and will be able to force more blood out of the heart. Furthermore, this means that there is an increased stroke volume, a high level of end-systolic volume, and a decreased level of end-systolic volume. Another function is respiration. There are many muscles found in the respiration system, known as the breathing pump muscles. Muscles used in respiration include the intercostal muscles and diaphragm. When inhaling, the diaphragm contracts and moves downwards. This means the pressure is decreased and the volume is increased, meaning air will be sucked in. Inspiratory muscles aid in expanding the thoracic cavity during an inhalation also. On the other hand, during exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, becoming U-shaped, and the pressure is then increased as there is less space for air and the volume decreases, and therefore air is pushed out, known as exhalation. In a sporting scenario, the muscles of the respiratory system work harder and faster to suck air in and out to provide the lungs with oxygen and remove waste products of carbon dioxide. When regular exercise occurs over a long period of time, the respiratory muscles become stronger, allowing more air to be sucked in with less breaths. This means air can be passed in and out of the body much faster, and oxygen can be supplied to the lungs with less effort. Therefore, the breathing rate will decrease the more physically and aerobically fit you are. Another function is thermal regulation. The body attempts to keep its temperature at around 37 degrees, and the body can be extremely damaged and even lead to death if these temperatures are not kept. Hypothermia can occur where the body temperature is too low, and if the body temperature is too high, brain damage and death can occur. Therefore, thermoregulation keeps the body at its optimal temperature. It does this by sending signals from the central nervous system to the organs to either cool down or warm them up. During cooling down, sweating takes place. This is when the sweat glands release sweat which evaporates and cools down the skin. Vasodilation can also occur to cool the body down. This is when blood vessels under the skin become wider, which will raise the volume of blood to where it is cooler, and heat can be lost by evaporation. On the other hand, during the warming up phase, vasoconstriction and shivering can occur. Vasoconstriction is when the blood vessels become much smaller and more narrow, which prevents heat loss by evaporation, as it decreases blood flow to the skin. Shivering can also take place when trying to warm up. This is when muscles contract slightly and each contraction produces heat. This is the body's way in which thermoregulation occurs. Another function is the digestive system. Muscles are also in operation when digesting food. Firstly, when food enters the mouth, muscles of the jaw and tongue break down food into smaller pieces so it can be swallowed. Muscles of the throat then perform peristalsis, whereby the food is passed down into the stomach, where muscular contractions take place to break down the food further. The mouth and jaw muscles are known as skeletal muscles, and the brain tells them when to chew, etc. Therefore, they are voluntary. Whereas the stomach muscles are classified as a smooth muscle, where involuntary contractions occur. The time frame of how these muscles work is very slow. It normally takes around a day or many hours to pass food fully through the digestive system. Moving on to the constriction of blood vessels. Muscles also work when constricting blood vessels, as mentioned earlier about vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Vasodilation can occur to cool the body down, as talked about earlier, and vasoconstriction can occur to prevent heat loss by evaporation, as talked about earlier. There are four main characteristics of muscles. Firstly, excitability, which is the ability for muscles to be able to respond to stimuli. Neurons are sent to the central nervous system, which can tell the muscles to contract, causing movement. In a sporting scenario, this is important for when a basketball comes into contact with the hand when receiving a pass. The muscles will become excited and contract to control the ball. Extensibility is another. It allows muscles to stretch beyond its resting length. This is important in sporting scenarios such as jumping up to catch a ball in American football. Whilst in the preparation stage of doing this, the quadricep extends past its resting length, ready to jump upwards. Another characteristic is contractibility. This is when muscles of the body also have a characteristic of being able to shorten actively and exert a pull or tension that can be used by connective tissues, tendons, when stimulated by a neural input. Myosin is binded to myofilaments in the muscles and pulls, causing the muscle to contract by becoming shorter and fatter. Contractions happen all the time and are essential in sport when performing anything. There are two types of contractions in the muscles, isometric and isotonic. These will be explained later in the assignment. Lastly, elasticity is the final characteristic of muscles that allow them to rebound to its original position after a contraction without damaging the muscle. This usually happens after extensibility. Muscles require elasticity for them to be able to carry out their function. In a sporting scenario, after executing a jump, the muscles have extended past its original point. Then with elasticity, they return back to its original position. There are three main types of muscles that are found in the body: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. They all vary in structure and function for the task they carry out. One contrast of the three varieties of muscles is where they are located. Smooth muscles are located in the walls of hollow organs and tubes, like your intestines, esophagus, and stomach. However, skeletal muscles are found at the bone and connect to tendons at the end of bones, acting as levers. Lastly, cardiac muscles are found only in the axial part of the skeleton, more specifically the myocardium. Each type of muscle has a different structure to carry out a particular function. For example, smooth muscles in appearance do not contain striations, unlike cardiac muscles and skeletal muscles, which do have striations visible on the cells. Smooth muscles have myosin and actin arranged in a stair-like pattern across the cells shown in the figure. The actin filaments stretch across from one end to the other, connecting at dense bodies at the cell membrane. The actin and myosin are angles to each other. On the other hand, you can see in the image in skeletal and cardiac muscles, the arrangement is different, as the actin filaments are attached to a Z-plate. Another difference between the three muscles is the size. Cardiac muscles have small branching fibers, and its size is around 50 to 100 millimeters in length. Cardiac muscles are also binucleated. In contrast, smooth muscles are fusiform in shape. This means that they have tapered ends but are wide in the middle. Smooth muscles also contain a single nucleus known as uninucleated. Skeletal muscles are long and cylindrical in size, unlike cardiac and smooth muscles. Skeletal muscles can range up to 30 centimeters long, such as in the sartorius. Also, skeletal muscles are multinucleated. The main function of the three muscles differ. The function of the skeletal muscle is for movement, which occurs all the time. The muscles contract by excitability, and antagonistic pairs work together, contracting and relaxing to pull on the tendon which pulls on the bone, causing movement. However, the function of cardiac muscles is very different. This is because their function is to contract and inject blood around the body to muscles to supply oxygen and keep us living. In contrast, both of these muscle types, smooth muscles, carry out multiple functions such as the digestive tract, maintaining the artery's diameter, and regulating airflow in the lungs. Moving on from functions to how these type of muscles are controlled. Firstly, smooth muscles are controlled by the autonomous nervous system, similarly to the cardiac muscles. The ANS means that impulses are sent automatically to and from the central nervous system, either the spinal brain, and are involuntary, meaning no thought process occurs for these actions. For example, a heartbeat happens without telling it to do so. Whereas a skeletal muscle differs, as they require the central nervous system and are controlled voluntarily. This means that a thought process occurs to move skeletal muscles, such as thinking to kick a ball, because the brain sends electrical impulses telling the muscles to contract, causing movement to kick the ball. Smooth cardiac and skeletal muscles also have different or similar rates of fatigability compared with each other. Firstly, the cardiac and smooth muscles are similar in their fatigability because both of these muscles have to work for life, therefore are not able to fatigue or death may occur, especially in the cardiac muscles. However, skeletal muscles can fatigue. This is because they are cellular mechanisms that repeatedly perform the same movements, and a high frequency or intensity of working the muscle can lead to a build-up of a waste product called lactic acid. Lactic acid can cause muscular fatigue. Respiration also varies in the three types of muscles. In cardiac muscles, they gain energy from containing large amounts of mitochondria, which enables them to produce a high number of ATP, energy. The heart gains energy from aerobic metabolism from different nutrients. This is similar to skeletal muscles, which get energy from ATP, adenosine triphosphate. The energy mostly is taken from the nutrients we digest. Finally, the smooth muscles derive their energy from the hydrolysis of ATP. Skeletal muscle growth anatomy. A muscle is not a single solid piece of tissue. Here I explain what a muscle is made up of using these components. Muscles are structured using connective tissues. Muscles are covered in a protective sheath known as the epimysium. This reduces friction against other muscles or bone, and is the outside muscle. Also, the epimysium continues at the end of the muscles to form tendons, along with other connective tissues. Tendons are also structures found at the muscles. Tendons connect muscles to the bone and a dense fibrous connective tissue. They transmit forces from the muscle to the bone, absorbing shock and force to prevent injury to the muscle. Tendons are firmly connected to muscle fibers at one end and to parts at the other end. Going back to the muscle, each muscle contains a number of bundles of muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are cylindrical muscle cells. This is called the fasciculi. These fascicles are contained within another connective tissue known as the perimysium, which is found within the body of the muscle. The bundle of muscle fibers can hold up to 100 muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are covered in a protective connective tissue called the endomysium, which is within the muscle and is more delicate and surrounds the individual muscle cells. Beneath the endomysium, the sarcolemma is found. The origin of a muscle is the attachment site that does not move during contraction, whereas the insertion is the attachment site that does move during contraction. In a sporting example, using the muscles of biceps brachii in the arm, the origin of this muscle is the scapula, however the insertion is the radial tuberosity. Usually the origin is more proximal to the body and the insertion is distal to the body. The fasciculi is the plural term for fascicles, which are bundles of muscle fibers that are surrounded by the perimysium. The skeletal muscles have a very large supply of blood vessels. The blood vessels in muscles aid in contraction. In order for a muscle to be able to contract, a nerve cell has to give out an impulse to the muscle, a vein and artery are within each nerve that pierces the epimysium of a skeletal muscle. The nerves and blood vessels are found along the connective tissues of muscles of a nerve cell and in capillaries. The neuron controlling muscles is very important, and in skeletal muscle fibers the neuron control is created by an axon terminal of the motor unit, which enables the muscle to contract. In the muscle fiber there is only one motor unit. A motor unit consists of a group of muscle fibers innervated by a single motor neuron. A motor neuron controls the amount of force that is exerted by the muscle fiber. Types of causes of fatigability that can occur in the skeletal muscles: metabolic fatigue and neuron fatigue. Metabolic fatigue occurs when there is a shortage of fuel in the muscle fiber, or when the accumulation of substances within the muscle fiber interfere with the release of calcium. Neuron fatigue occurs when the nerve signal weakens. In athletes who perform strength training, the ability to generate force is limited by the nerve's ability to sustain a high-frequency signal. Delayed onset muscle soreness can occur depending on how much stress is put on the tendons and muscles. In strength training, it increases the ability to generate high-frequency, sustained signals to allow the muscles to contract with its greatest force. There are also different muscle types within the muscle fascicles. In smooth muscles, the fascicle type of structure is a fusiform structure. Fusiform is a structure in smooth muscles that are spindle-like shaped and are wide in the middle but are tapered at the ends. There is also a circular type of fascicle structure in which muscles are arranged in concentric rings. They surround external body openings and close by contracting. They can also be called sphincter muscles and can be found around muscles in the mouth. Another type is called convergent. In this arrangement, the muscle has a broad origin. The fascicles are joined towards a single tendon or insertion, such as the pectoralis major. There is also types such as the parallel and pennate arrangement. In the parallel type, the length of the fascicles are parallel to the long axis of the muscle. In the pennate, the fascicles are short and attach obliquely to a central tendon that runs the length of the muscles. Muscles have many different roles, including agonists. In an antagonistic pair, there are two muscle pairs which work together to cause movement of the bone. This happens by one contracting and the other relaxing. An agonist is the prime mover in this motion, the contracting muscle. In a sporting example, when lifting a dumbbell, the biceps brachii contract whilst the triceps relax. Therefore, the biceps brachii act as the agonist. The other in an antagonistic pair is the antagonist. The antagonist is the muscle during a movement that relaxes and lengthens whilst the agonist contracts. In a sporting scenario, during a bicep curl, the triceps brachii act as an antagonist as they lengthen during the movement and are relaxed. Another muscle role is synergists. Synergist muscles work in motion with another muscle in order to generate a movement. They help neutralize extra movements from the prime mover in order to make sure the force created is worked in the desired plane. Synergist function also helps to stabilize and keep the movement of the muscles the same. They can reduce the amount of work muscles perform. Fixators. Another muscle is the fixator, in which the part that controls and stabilizes the origin of the agonist and the joint that it moves about. Synergists can also provide movement in some cases. This is shown in the bicep curl, when the brachiodialis and the brachialis helps the biceps brachii to stabilize and create movement at the joint. The origin is the attachment point that does not move during a contraction by the agonist. The origin is usually proximal and closer to the body, and is also larger in mass than the insertion. For example, the latissimus dorsi muscle's origin is the torso, which does not move whilst the latissimus dorsi contracts. Lastly, the insertion is the attachment site which does move during the contraction of the agonist. It is usually distal and further away to the body than the origin, and is also a smaller mass. An example of an insertion is the arm when the latissimus dorsi contracts. There are many major muscles of the body. As you can see on the left-hand side of the diagram, the anterior side of the muscles. There are muscles such as the pectoralis major, which make up the chest, and the external obliques around the stomach area. However, on the other side, on the posterior side of the body, there are muscles such as the triceps brachii, the trapezius, and the latissimus dorsi. In the shoulder joint, there is agonists such as the anterior deltoid, posterior deltoid, latissimus dorsi, rotator cuff muscles, pectoralis major, and medial deltoid. These all have similar or different origins, insertions, antagonists, and movements. For example, the anterior deltoid is an agonist, and the antagonist that works with this is the latissimus dorsi. The origin is the clavicle and scapula, and the insertion is the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. This provides the movement of flexion. In the radio-ulnar and elbow and knee joints, they all have 2 agonists and 2 antagonists. For example, in the knee, the agonist is the hamstring, whereas the antagonist is the quadricep, whilst providing flexion of the knee. The origin of this is the ischial tuberosity, and insertion is the tibia and fibula, as you can see on the diagram on the bottom right hand side. As you can see in the diagram on the right of the hip joint, there are different movements that can occur, such as flexion, rotation of the thigh at the hip, extension of the leg, and abduction and adduction. Whilst in adduction, the agonist is the adductors, the origin is the pubis and ischium, the insertion is the tibia and femur, and the gluteus is the maximus and medius and minimus. In the spine, there are agonists such as the internal obliques, external obliques, rectus abdominis, and erector spinae. As you can see on the diagram here, movements such as rotating the trunk and bending it sideways. The origin in this movement is the inguinal ligament, iliac crest, and lumbodorsal fascia. The insertion is the linea alba, rib, and pectineal line, and the antagonist and agonist is internal obliques and external obliques. There are 3 different types of muscle fibers that are found within the body: slow oxidative muscle fiber type 1, fast oxidative glycolytic fiber type 2A, and fast glycolytic fiber type 2B. Each type of muscle fiber provides the body with a different function. They also differ in structure. The muscle types aid in contrasting ways, providing athletes with characteristics that can improve certain parts of their game. The main function of slow oxidative muscle fiber type 1 is to work for long periods of time, aerobically without fatigue. This is important for athletes such as Mo Farah, because he is a long distance runner and needs his muscles to work for very long periods of time without producing lactic acid, slowing him down. In contrast to this, fast oxidative glycolytic muscle fibers' main function is for when muscles work less than 30 minutes, but more than 1 minute before fatiguing, such as when walking or sprinting. Finally, fast glycolytic muscle fiber primary function is to carry out large short bursts of power movements, such as lifting a large weight in a weightlifting competition or swinging a cricket bat to hit the ball in cricket. In all 3 of the muscle fiber types there are many contrasting structural characteristics, such as in slow oxidative muscle fiber types they have the smallest diameter in fiber compared to the type 2A and type 2B. Also, muscle fiber type 1 has a very high capillary density in contrast with the other muscle fiber types. This means that there is a large blood vessel supply of slow oxidative muscle fibers. Therefore, there is a lot of blood flowing through this fiber type. This causes the fiber type to become red in colour, as hemoglobin in the blood is very red. As the fiber diameter is also very small in type 1 muscle fibers, it means that it is a very reddish colour. However, in type 2B, muscle fibers is very different. This is because type 2B muscle fibers have a very low capillary density. This means that there is not much blood vessels running through the muscle fiber. Therefore, less oxygen is delivered compared to the other fiber types. It does not carry a lot of blood, so there is less hemoglobin, which contains red pigments and produces a reddish hue. Therefore, fast glycolytic fibers appear a whitish pink. This is also in contrast the fast oxidative glycolytic muscle fibers, because they have a high capillary density. Therefore, they also have a lot of blood passing through its fiber, meaning it is able to drop a significant amount of oxygen to the tissue. However, it does not appear as bright and red as type 1 muscle fibers because it is much larger. It has the largest fiber diameter of all 3 muscle fibers. As it has a large capillary density and larger size, it means it appears a pinkish red because the blood vessels do not take up the whole fiber compared to type 1 muscle fibers. A second contrast in structural characteristics is the mitochondria content. In slow oxidative muscle fibers, there is a large number of mitochondria. This is because mitochondria are very important for the production of ATP energy. They take fats, glucose, amino acids, and oxygen, which is compulsory in order to make ATP. This is why a high capillary density for type 1 muscle fibers is important, as it is needed for aerobic cellular respiration. Similarly to this, fast oxidative muscle fibers also contain lots of mitochondria, as they depend on oxygen. In aerobic respiration, the oxygen is utilised to produce ATP once again. In contrast to both type 1 and type 2A muscle fibers, the fast glycolytic muscle fibers do not contain very many mitochondria. There is not a high capillary density through type 2B muscle fibers, meaning that not much oxygen is being delivered to the fiber, so there is no need for mitochondria. Type 2B muscle fibers therefore mainly use anaerobic pathways for respiration and have almost no aerobic respiration. In type 1 muscle fibers there is a high myoglobin content. This means it can temporarily hold on to oxygen. The oxygen binds to the myoglobin so that whenever the tissue needs it, it can drop the oxygen off. This can increase the production of ATP as oxygen is needed in this aerobic cellular respiration. This differs in fast glycolytic muscle fibers as they have a very small number of myoglobin, because it produces energy anaerobically with no oxygen, so myoglobin is not needed. However, this differs again from type 2A muscle fibers because they do contain a high number of myoglobin, because they can produce energy aerobically, similarly to type 1 muscle fibers. The metabolic stages of each muscle fiber type differs. In type 1 muscle fibers, ATP is produced under oxidative phosphorylation. They are the slowest in contractility speed out of all three muscle fibers. This is because the rate at which ATP activity occurs is very slow. The sliding filament theory occurs much slower, meaning the speed at which it contracts is not as fast. Also, type 1 muscle fibers go through anaerobic conditions, meaning it goes through many aerobic pathways to produce ATP, decreasing the speed at which it can contract. Comparing this with fast oxidative muscle fibers, it shows that contractility speed is much different. This is because on the metabolic stages it does anaerobic and aerobic respiration, mostly aerobic. In the anaerobic stage, creatine phosphate and ADP join on the enzyme known as creatine kinase, which is called the creatine phosphate pathway. The cross-bridge and sliding filament theory will happen much faster due to the contractility speed is faster than type 1 muscle fibers due to a fast myosin ATP activity. In comparison, fast glycolytic muscle fibers contract at a much faster rate in the metabolic stages of creating energy anaerobically. In type 2B muscle fibers, a significant number of glycogen granules called glycosomes are broken down along with polymers of glucose called glycogen into glucose. The process is called glycolysis. This then gets broken down into pyruvate, producing a little amount of ATP at a fast rate. Because it produces ATP very fast and the ATPase activity happens very quickly, this means that there is an increased contractility rate. Similarly to type 2A muscle fibers, creatine phosphate and ADP join with creatine kinase enzyme to create ATP anaerobically. In type 1 muscle fibers, the storage molecules are called triglycerides, which go into the mitochondria, and beta-oxidation, which produces a lot of ATP. The glycerol will also go into the glycolytic pathway to produce more ATP. They have a low level of PC stores because it only lasts for 10 seconds, when type 1 muscle fibers work over an extended period of time. Glycogen stores are also low as they get used up during exercise. In contrast to this, type 2B muscle fibers have a high amount of PC stores because not much of them are being used. There are a high percentage of glycogen and triglyceride stores because they are not being used for a long period of time, unlike slow-twitch fibers. Fast oxidative muscle fibers contain a high amount of PC stores and glycogen stores because type 2A needs bursts of energy that will last for short amounts of time. Triglyceride stores are moderate in number because bursts of energy are needed. The functional characteristics of each muscle fiber differ. In type 1 muscle fibers there is a high oxidative capacity because there is a high capillary density, meaning a high supply of oxygen, which therefore increases aerobic capacity. Although there is a very low glycolytic ability in type 1 muscle fibers because they produce energy aerobically, not anaerobically. This is similar to fast oxidative glycolytic muscle fibers, as they have a high oxidative capacity and also a moderate glycolytic ability. However, type 2B muscle fibers have a very low oxidative capacity because there is a very low capillary density, meaning there is not a high supply of oxygen. This is because type 2B muscle fibers produce energy via anaerobic pathways, therefore they have a high glycolytic ability. The motor unit size is variable between the three. In type 1 muscle fibers, the motor unit size is greater because it is more fatigue resistant compared to the others. The motor unit size decreases for fast oxidative glycolytic and is smallest for fast glycolytic. The level of fatigue resistance is also differentiating between each type of muscle fiber. In slow oxidative muscle fibers, they are extremely fatigue resistant. This is because it contracts much more slowly and does not generate a high force of contraction because of its slow contractility speed and small diameter. However, in contrast to this, fast oxidative glycolytic muscle fibers are moderately fatigue resistant. This is because it generates a moderate level of force of contraction, but not as much compared to fast glycolytic muscle fibers, and is good at breaking down ATP and ADP and inorganic phosphates very fast. On the other hand, fast glycolytic muscle fibers have the worst fatigue resistance because they contract so fast anaerobically and produce such a large force of contraction, it causes the muscles to become fatigued very quickly, under 1 minute. Therefore, the recruitment order of muscles is that slow oxidative muscle fibers are recruited first, then fast oxidative muscle fibers second, and lastly fast glycolytic. This is because the motor neuron engages with type 1 first. However, if what it is trying to achieve requires more force or power, fast oxidative muscle fibers will be recruited, but if that does not produce enough power, then glycolytic muscle fibers will be recruited. In sports examples, the fast oxidative muscle fibers would be most relevant to performers such as Jessica Ennis, who compete in multi-eventing disciplines. They will use fast oxidative glycolytic because they have to run for a long period of time but also perform powerful movements quickly such as shot put. In slow oxidative muscle fibers, however, they would be more relevant for longer distance runners such as Mo Farah. Lastly, fast glycolytic muscle fibers would be relevant for sprinters under 100 meters such as Usain Bolt and powerlifters who need to exert a lot of force and power in a short burst. Whilst performing a skill beforehand, stimuli is collected and the brain makes a decision as to what to do, for example, change direction or run into space. In order for muscles to contract to perform this process of nerve transmission and the sliding theory with processes at the neuromuscular junction must occur. First of all, nerve transmission. The transmission of nerves impulses along a neuron from one end to another occurs because of an electrical change across the membrane of a neuron. On an unstimulated neuron, the membrane is polarized, meaning there is a difference in electrical charge between the outside and the inside of the membrane. The inside of the membrane is negative compared to the outside. Polarization is when the outside of the electrical charge of sodium ions on the outside of the membrane is positive, while the electrical charge of sodium ions on the inside of the membrane is negative. Axion potential is when a neuron sends information down an axon away from the cell body. Schwann cells are made up of dendrites, a cell body, and an axon. The cell body is the spherical part of the neuron that contains the nucleus. The cell body connects to the dendrites, which brings information to the neuron, and the axon, which sends information to other neurons. When information is received from another neuron, dendrites pass info to the cell body, which sends information to the axon. There are two parts of the axon, the bare part called the nose of Ranvier and the myelin sheath. The information travels across the axon via saltatory conduction, which speeds up the process of propagation. The refractory period is the time during which stimulus is given to the neuron will not lead to another axion potential. If the brain wants muscles to generate a small force, then there will be less recruitment of motor units. If a greater force is needed, then more motor units will be recruited. If the stimuli comes less frequently, the muscles will recover then twitch. If it is more frequent, the force is summated and built up to be more forceful, and no relaxation of the muscles will occur, such as in an arm wrestle the force is built up. High stimulation frequency leads to a fused tetanus. The neuromuscular junction is the term used to describe the synapse between a motor neuron and a skeletal muscle fiber. When a motor neuron approaches a muscle, it branches out into several extensions that end in synaptic boutons. The synaptic bouton found in the presynaptic membrane is separated from the end plate by the synaptic cleft. The deep holes that can be seen on the diagram below the synaptic cleft are known as the junctional folds, and they contain many acetylcholine receptors in the postsynaptic membrane. When an axion potential travels down the motor neuron, this enables the release of acetylcholine in the axon terminal into the synaptic cleft from the synaptic bouton. The acetylcholine binds to the receptors in the junctional folds, which allows ion channels to open up to allow positive sodium ions to flow, causing depolarization, called excitatory postsynaptic potential. An enzyme called acetylcholinesterase is found at the neuromuscular junction, and its function is to break down acetylcholine and also terminate its effect on the muscle fiber, ending the communication between motor neuron and muscle fiber. To reduce the chance of fatigue, the motor neurons will change to a different motor neuron to allow periods of rest and recovery whilst the other contracts. The sliding filament theory is how muscles contract to be able to produce a force. Muscle fibers are specialized cells made up of myofibrils. In the myofibril arrangement, the sarcomere is a segment to which a fibril of muscle is divided. The M line is an attachment point for myosin filaments, and the Z line provides an attachment for actin filaments. The H band is where only myosin is present, and the I band is where actin is only present. The A band is the section of myofibril containing the myosin filaments, and a sarcomere is one of the segments into which a fibril of muscle is divided. In the sliding filament theory, in order for a muscle to contract, a stimulus has to be detected via the sensory organs, such as the eyes, for example, seeing a ball being passed to you in football. The information is sent via sensory neurons to the brain, which decides what to do. The impulse goes from the brain to the spine, and the central nervous system sends electrical impulses via motor neurons. This impulse arrives at the neuromuscular junction and travels across myelin, which is myelinated, and causes saltatory conduction, which is when the impulse jumps over the myelin, which speeds up the process of propagation. Then, the impulse arrives at the vesicle, which holds the ACH and releases it through the synaptic cleft. The impulse then travels to the presynaptic membrane, past the synapse, and into the postsynaptic cell covered in receptors. The impulse is then carried down to the T tubules, where depolarization takes place, causing calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The calcium then binds with troponin, which alters the shape of troponin, causing the tropomyosin to move off the actin binding sites. The troponin and tropomyosin blocks the myosin binding site, preventing muscular contraction from taking place. This means that the myosin heads are able to bind with the actin binding sites to form a cross bridge. Hydrolysis of ATP occurs at the myosin head before this, so that myosin can perform a power stroke, whereby the sarcomere appears to be shortened, as the myosin pulls the actin closer to the center, sliding past each other, known as a muscular contraction. ATP binds to the myosin heads against, causing the cross bridge to be broken, so that when the ATP is hydrolyzed again, the myosin can attach further down to make the sarcomere shorter. If calcium and ATP are still present, the process will be repeated. Types of muscle contractions. Whilst using different muscles during sports, there are three main different ways in which they are able to contract. For example, isometric contraction occurs frequently in sports such as gymnastics, where positions have to be held with control, like hanging from gymnastic rings in a fixed position. However, there are also other ways in which the muscle can contract, such as isotonic muscle contraction. There are two variations of this type of contraction, concentric and eccentric, which both occur in a bicep curl, for example. Isokinetic muscle contraction are much like an isotonic contraction, where the muscle shortens as it contracts. However, it occurs at a constant rate. Firstly, isometric muscle contractions is when the muscle produces tension but stays the same length, and there is no movement at the joint. Gym exercises such as performing a plank or wall sit are a good example of an isometric contraction. During these contractions, the force of gravity and body weight is an important factor for producing muscle tension. There are two types of isotonic muscle contractions called eccentric and concentric. Eccentric muscle contractions is when the muscle lengthens as it contracts because the muscle fibers are stretched, whereas in concentric muscle contractions the muscle becomes short and fat because the fibers become shorter during the contraction. For example, in a bicep curl, both eccentric and concentric muscle contractions take place. However, on the upward phase for the concentric muscle contraction of the biceps brachii to occur, the force of the biceps has to be greater than the weight of the dumbbell and the force of gravity. Otherwise, the dumbbell will not be able to be lifted. Similarly, on the eccentric phase, when the biceps brachii are stretched as a controlled movement, the force of the dumbbells and the gravity has to be just slightly above the force of the biceps brachii. If the force is too heavy of the dumbbells and gravity, the motion on the way down will not be controlled, and an injury may be caused from dropping the weights too violently. Lastly, isokinetic muscle contraction is when the muscle shortens as it contracts. However, it does so at a consistent rate of speed. These types of muscular contractions can build endurance and speed. An example of this is the leg extension machine found in a gym. This is because the rate at which the leg extension can occur can be set a set speed, but also you're able to increase the resistance without moving or using more energy or fatiguing muscles halfway through the set. Reference page.